that so I don't forget as well. Okay. Now, as I said, of course we have this week, and then next week we have spring break, and you all are coming pretty religiously to class sessions, and I think that's good. I think at the end of the semester that will show up. I think it's hard to do well in this class, particularly since we're taking quizzes every class meeting. You know, it's hard to do well if you're not coming regularly. Of course, I'm preaching to the choir because you're all here and you're here pretty regularly. But based on my experience, for many years, I just want to say that it is hard, apparently, for people to continue to coming religiously to classes after spring break. I don't know what it is about that week off. Sometimes, just strictly from a faculty standpoint, you know, from an educational standpoint, I entertain the idea that maybe we ought to lose that, but that's not likely to happen. I'm just want to make sure, I want to give you full encouragement that, don't ease off the accelerator after spring break, keep pressing ahead, and before you know it, the second half of the semester will be over, and you'll be happy that you stuck with it and was vigilant about your attendance. Okay. Oh, the other thing I want to mention to you real quickly is some of you have probably seen this, but just in case, I know in the face-to-face classes, people aren't necessarily going out to the course website as regularly as the people in the online class. The Core Competency 2 is now accessible to you, okay? So this one is a little bit different, okay? There's not a separate instructions document, and you're not submitting anything by turn it in. It's really kind of set up in Blackboard the same way that an exam would be set up, okay? So just come over here to Core Competency Assessments, click on that link, and then scroll down to the very bottom. You see here Core Competency Assessment 2 on social responsibility, personal responsibility, understanding the Democratic and Republican Party platforms. If we click on that, I'm going to go ahead and click on it. You can see that here in the instructions, I've provided some information for you on personal responsibility and social responsibility. And then I've actually set it up as sort of a series of steps that you need to complete, right? So the first step is for you to read and think about these concepts of social responsibility, personal responsibility. And then the next step is that you look at the Democratic Party platform, and I provided the link for you to that for you here directly. Same thing with the Republican Party platform. And then you're going to answer a series of questions based on that information, okay? So notice here it says that it's due. It says this test, but it's not really a test. It's just set up that way in Blackboard, okay? So the assessment is due no later than 11:59 p.m. on April 17th. So you have a little while to do it. And I believe that you should be able to do it. Some of you may choose to do it as I indicated in the announcement, if you saw the announcement. Some of you may choose to do it all in one sitting, right? Others, I think it's more likely that most of you will probably want to do it in increments. So I believe that you should be able to get into this and get out of it as many times as you want to, as long as you get it submitted by 11:59 p.m. on April the 17th, you're okay. Now, if anybody tries that and they run into trouble, please report to me as soon as possible so I can investigate what the issue might be, okay? All right, so anyway, it's out there now for you. Obviously, you just click that begin button and you will see the questions. It's going to give you a text box and you can type your answers into the text box. Or if you prefer, I don't think it's a bad practice at all to compose your answers in a word processing program and then, take advantage of the spell check feature and the grammar check features and all that kind of stuff and format it, or if you want to, all that sort of stuff. Make it pleasing to your own eye, if not to mine. And then you can just copy it and paste it into the text box, okay? Either way you want to do it, that's fine, okay? But as I said, particularly if you run it, if you start it and then you leave it and then you try to get back into it and you run into some sort of problem, please let me know, because I want to get that worked out quickly. Okay? I've never set this up in this way before. I think it should work. I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work, but I need to know if you run into some trouble. Okay? All right, any questions about that? Okay. Well, let's begin some new material. We're going to move on this week to our topic on political parties. And I want to begin this treatment a little bit differently, perhaps, than we have our other topics. I want to share with you a couple of passages from two preeminent scholars in my discipline, political scientists, whose expertise is in the American political system generally, but particularly in political parties. Okay? So this first passage is from the eminent Professor Walter Dean Burnham, who was for many years down at the University of Texas in Austin. And I don't know if he's still there or not. I kind of doubt it, but he might even be deceased. I just don't know. But here's his take on political parties. Right? He writes in his book called The End of American Party Politics that political parties, with all their well-known human and structural shortcomings, are the only devices thus far invented by the wit of Western man that can, with some effectiveness, generate countervailing collective power on behalf of the many who are individually powerless against the relatively few who are individually or organizationally powerful. They're talking about the political parties. Their disappearance as active intermediaries would only entail the ascendancy of the already powerful. Now, Burnham is writing this, actually, the first edition of this book, I think, was the 1980s. Okay, so this verbiage that you're seeing here goes back a little ways, but I think there's still a lot of meat, right, on it, that we're going to develop in this relatively short passage, right? The second one comes from the also very eminent scholar, Dr. Frank Soroff, who last I knew was at the University of Minnesota. Here's his take in his book called Political Parties in America. The American parties, and all others for that matter, mobilize sheer numbers against organized minorities with other political resources. And I've inserted there in the parentheses, for clarification purposes, most notably economic resources. That's my insertion. That's not in his text. But I think he would agree with that. I think that's what he's talking about. Okay? And they do so in the one avenue of political action in which sheer numbers of individuals count most heavily, elections. Thus, the parties have classically been the mechanism by which newly enfranchised and powerless electorates have risen to power. In a more fluid politics with a large number of organizations, and again, I've inserted parenthetically because I think this is what he's talking about, interest groups, and millions more uncommitted or independent voters, the fear is that the advantage will be on the side of the well-organized minorities with other political resources. I wonder what kind of political resources he's talking about. Well, we've already referred to economic resources, and I think that's what he would want us to emphasize. Okay? The political party is the political organization of the masses who lack the cues and information as well as the political resources of status, skills, and money to make a major impact on public decisions via other means. Okay, now, I can see some of you are writing. I don't know if you're trying to transcribe this information or not. It's really not necessary. I'm going to kind of summarize it here for you here. The next thing for us to do is I'm going to kind of boil this down to 3 basic propositions. But before I do that, let me just ask you, based on the reading that we just had, you saw the words on the screen, I read them to you out loud. Do you think that Burnham and Soroff are saying the same thing? Are their comments, in harmony? Are they saying something different? What's the gist? What did you take away from that as you were thinking about? Do you think they're essentially saying the same thing, or are they saying something pretty different?
I think they're both saying that that parties give this little guy a chance.
I think that's pretty good. Nate, I think that you kind of summarized it more concisely than I'm going to summarize it here in just a second. I think that's a pretty good way of putting it. Yeah, I think both Burnham and Soroff are in agreement on that point. Now, there's some other things embedded in what they say here that we kind of want to develop as well. But yeah, I agree with Nate completely that they seem to be saying the same thing. Okay, and to be a little bit more precise, as Nate put it, they give the little guy a chance. All right, so let's sort of boil this down to three basic points, three propositions. Okay, the first is where democracy exists in modern political systems, there are also strong, vital, competitive party systems. I'm not going to keep flipping back and forth to Burnham and Soroff's passages, but if you think about what they said, they really, again, you can kind of infer that what they're suggesting is that political parties and democracy go together. And in fact, it's not just sort of a coincidence or some sort of spurious correlation. I think what they're really suggesting to us is that democracy in the modern context that we think about democracy, we're not talking about ancient Athenian democracy here, we're talking about modern mass participatory democracy, that is really contingent upon the existence of a vital competitive party system, a functioning vital competitive party system. That you can't really have democracy without the existence of a competitive party system. Now, there are a couple of ways that we could go about demonstrating that point, okay? One is, sort of empirically, if I don't have one handy, but let's say I have a map of all the countries of the world up on the screen, and I say to each of you, when your turn comes, I call on you individually, and I ask you, pick a country up there, and we start here with Hisham because he's closest to me, and he picks. Just tell me your favorite country. Anything, any country in the world. Canada, that's a pretty good one, right? And I say, Hisham, I don't know how much you know about Canadian politics. Maybe a lot, maybe not very much. But do you have any sense of whether we can objectively refer to the Canadian system as a democracy? And what would your answer to that be? Do you think it's, objectively speaking, accurate to refer to Canada as a democracy? Okay, you have a couple of classmates who are nodding their heads that, yeah, I think it's squarely fits under that heading, right? There's no question objective. I think any political scientist, that we could bring in here to talk to you would say, of course, Canada is a democracy, okay? Now, if I was to follow that up by asking you, again, I don't know how much you know about Canadian politics, but do they have a competitive party system in Canada? The answer to that would be, yeah, they do, absolutely. They have a multi-party system, but the major parties include what they call the Progressive Conservative Party in Canada, and there's a Labour Party in Canada, and there's a few other ones as well, okay? So yeah, they have a competitive party system, and then we come over here across from you, and we ask Joanna. Joanna, tell us your favorite country.
My favorite?
Well, no, you can pick any country.
Russia.
Russia, okay? That's going to be an interesting choice, okay? I don't know how much you know about Russian politics, but is it accurate to say that Russia is a democracy? I say it's an interesting choice because, Russia's obviously been a country in transition since the collapse of communism in 1991. They went through that period in the 1990s under the leadership of Boris Yeltsin, where many people in the West, including the United States, were sort of reaching the conclusion that Russia is becoming a democracy, right? It's right there, at least on the threshold of being a full-fledged democracy. But then Yeltsin goes away, retires, and sort of handpicks Vladimir Putin to replace him. And things have changed, somewhat significantly since Putin became the premier or the leader of Russia. So what would your judgment on that be? Is Russia a democracy?
So I would say that they try and present to the world that they're a democracy, but I don't think they are. I don't think that's on Putin's agenda.
That's an interesting observation because it's something that in a different context I might also point out to you all, that there's the facade of democracy, but democratic, when you have a system where you have the appearance of democracy, where you have these sort of democratic institutions, at least superficially, they can be overridden or controlled or manipulated by powerful individuals or groups of individuals. And I think it's problematic to conclude that Russia is a democracy. And it's certainly not the former one-party communist state that we saw during the Soviet Union period, but Putin's leadership, the party, I don't even know what his party is, but is it the Communist Party? I don't know, but it's got a defective, monopoly on political power. And we see, for example, what happens to dissidents who challenge Putin and his party. So, we'd probably put Russia under the heading of not a democracy, or at best, transitional or something like that, but probably not a democracy, but also not a competitive party system. Anyway, so we go around the room like that, and we develop a list. On the one side, we have countries that are democracies. On the other heading, under the other heading, we have countries that are not democracies. Just give me a few more countries real quick that we would put under the heading of democracies. Got Canada. How about the UK? Okay. How about Germany? Okay. How about France? Italy, Spain. In fact, most of the countries of Europe we're going to put under that heading, right? How about the United States? Yeah, we're going to put that under that heading. How about Japan? How about Australia? How about New Zealand, right? How about India, Israel, right? In fact, there are many countries that we could put under this heading of democracies. And what we would find is that every single one of those, we get to that second question, do they have a competitive party system? The answer in each case is yes, they have a competitive party system. And then over here we have the list of countries that are not democracies. And there are some obvious cases there. There are some other cases that I say, like, maybe Russia as an example is questionable. It's a little bit more nuanced, right? But what would clearly go under the heading of not democracy? How about North Korea? Right? Okay. Anybody else want to pick one? How about Cuba? Okay, maybe put Cuba up there. Okay. What? The People's Republic of China, right? Okay. And again, in each one of those cases, when we get to the second question, do they have a competitive party system? The answer is going to be no. Either they have, in most cases, it's going to be like a one-party monopoly, a communist party monopoly, or just some sort of non-existent or dysfunctional party system altogether, which is really what they may have in Russia. Again, I'm not an expert on Russian politics. I am the last person really to comment authoritatively, but maybe that's really kind of what they have, is sort of a dysfunctional party system in Russia. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say we can sort of demonstrate that empirically, just by looking at countries that qualify as democracies. And we haven't even, in this class, really haven't laid out what the criteria of democracy are. But I think you probably have some intuition about some of the qualities of democracy. For example, at a minimum, you would have to have free and fair elections, regular elections, not just when elections are convenient for the government, right? You would have to have competitive elections, right? Where it's not just the hand-picked candidates that are chosen by the government that get to run, right? You would want to have universal suffrage rights where everybody has the right to vote, right? Not just a few people or a select group of people. Most Americans would want to also include things like civil liberties rights, rights of, peaceably assemble, right of free speech, all those other cherished civil liberties rights that you're now somewhat familiar with from the previous topic on the syllabus, right? I think many Americans, not exclusively Americans, but certainly Americans would think that those are criteria of democracy as well, right? So we don't even have to go there because you have some intuition, I think, about what democracy is and what it requires. And you at least recognize when those criteria are not satisfied that it creates some problems for calling this country's political system or that country's political system a democracy. All right? Okay? So, we can see that a genuine democracy, a healthy democracy, requires a competitive party system. As I said, it's really that the former, democracy, is contingent upon the existence of the latter, a competitive party system. Okay? We can also demonstrate that point historically. For example, if I was to ask you, in what country do you believe that modern mass participatory, the way that we think about democracy today, again, we're not going to go back to ancient Athens, right? Modern mass participatory democracy, in what country did that first emerge? Anybody want to take a shot at that one? What would most political scientists tell you? France is problematic. You may be thinking about the French Revolution, which was based on liberty, equality, fraternity, those concepts. But whether the French were actually, because Napoleon came so quickly on the heels of the French Revolution, whether they were actually able to establish a true democratic republic for some time is questionable. Again, I'm not a historian, but I think that's probably a fair assessment. Well, most political scientists and historians would tell you that occurred in the United States first. It was really in the United States. And so what period might we be talking about? Well, it's really the period that the historians refer to as the Jacksonian era. In the early part of the 19th century, the 1820s, particularly the 1830s and beyond, was really the origins of modern mass participatory democracy. That happened in the United States first, as, for example, property qualifications for the right to vote began to be dropped. That, by the time we get to the 1830s, the end of that decade, property requirements for the right to vote have pretty much been dropped universally across the country. Of course, there were still restrictions based on race and gender. That took some time, but at least the property qualifications were dropped by that period. Okay? So, other aspects of, it's not all just about the right to vote, other aspects of mass participatory democracy. And certainly in the person of Andrew Jackson, the president, who was really, as many historians like to point out, the first real sort of populist president. Okay, so it happened in the United States first. We're talking about the Jacksonian period, which is the 1820s, certainly the 1830s. If I was to ask you, in what country did political parties as we know them today, we're going to make a distinction between two different types of political parties here in just a couple of minutes, but as we think about political parties today, in what country did they first emerge? Oh, not incoincidentally, also the United States. It was really in the United States where what we call mass membership political parties first emerged. Again, we'll get to that distinction here in just a couple of minutes. During the same period, the Jacksonian period, going back really to the end of the first party system certainly by the time we get to the second party system in the United States, we clearly see that transition. So in other words, it was the emergence of these political parties in the American system that really sort of reached out to the common person and brought the common person into the political process for the first time. It's not a coincidence that that happened like that. And when that happened, and after that happened in the United States, it began to happen in Europe. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, the end of the 1800s, democracy has spread all across the continent of Europe, and in the Americas, we see, like the Mexican Revolution occurs, in the 1820s, right? And the other former colonies of Spain begin to achieve their independence during the middle part of the 19th century as they move towards democratic systems. And then in the 20th century, you have the proliferation of democracy as well. By the time, for example, that the Russians have their revolution in 1917, as I said, the entire continent of Europe is been democratized for the most part. And then throughout the 20th century, and particularly toward the tail end of the 20th century, with the collapse of communism, you get the proliferation of democracy. And in each of these instances, as you see democracy spread to various places around the world, it manifests as an emergence of a competitive party system. Okay, so that's what I mean when I say that we could demonstrate this point both empirically and historically. Okay? All right, so let's move on. The second proposition is that, and again, I'm not going to go back to Burnham and Soroff's passages and look at them again, but there's embedded in their observations this notion that there's something going on in the American party system that suggests that the parties are losing control over many of their traditional functions, that they're in a state of decline or demise. That was a common theme back during the 1980s and the 1990s in the literature on political parties in the United States. Not just Burnham and Soroff. There was a lot of political scientists who were writing about the party system back during that period. Were writing a lot about this theme of decline of the party system or demise of the political parties. Well, if we understand that first proposition, that in order to have a healthy democracy, you have to have a competitive party system, then if you confront the realization that there's something going on in the American party system that suggests that the parties are in a state of decline or a state of demise, that might make you worry about the quality of American democracy as we move forward. Right? If the political parties are dysfunctional to a large extent, if the political parties are not really in a position to perform their democratic functions, then what about the quality of American democracy? And that's really kind of the bottom line for both Burnham and Soroff. So that's the last piece here that I'll throw up there on the screen for you. They're both asking us to seriously consider about what might happen if the party system continues to decline in the United States. What implications does that have for American democracy? And they suggest what I'm calling, they don't use this terminology, but I think it's consistent with the terminology that they do use, what I'm calling ironic elitist consequences. Okay? See, look, I will go back here for just a second. Okay? Notice this last sentence of Burnham's passage, right? Their disappearance, the disappearance of the political parties. And he doesn't mean like literally they just go away, right? He means in a functional sense, right? They become dysfunctional. They're in a poor position to perform their functions. Their disappearance as active intermediaries would only entail the ascendancy of the already powerful, the elite, right? And Soroff, in his passage, says that the fear is that the advantage will be on the side of well-organized minorities with other political resources, like money. It's probably not a coincidence that we have seen in your lifetimes. This has not always really been true. It's really been over the last quarter century or so, maybe the last 40 years. An increase in the number of independently wealthy candidates for public office. You know, there was a time in this country when wealthy people did not aspire to public office. They didn't run for offices like president, and I'm talking about like the really wealthy, powerful people. They didn't run for president. They didn't run for U.S. senator. They didn't run for governors, these positions, right? Now, those people who served in those positions were what I would because of my, material my background, my economic background, I would call them wealthy people, but not in the sense that we're talking about here, right? It wasn't until really the 1980s or so when you had this sort of explosion of billionaire candidates who were running for office. It's not enough anymore for them to just be super wealthy. Now they also got to be in the limelight, and they used to just want to be behind the scenes. Anyway, I'm digressing. The point is, Burnham and Soroff seem to be suggesting this point, right? That the decline of the political parties could produce ironically these consequences. Let me make the point here just one more way to you, and we do need to move on to other stuff. I want to show you this little graphic that I drew some time ago and see if we can really hammer this point home. So this is a democratic model, and that it suggested a democratic model by the upward flow, right? Because what those arrows, those upward pointing arrows, are designed to suggest to you is that somehow the policy decisions and actions that are made by government, here we have the familiar legislative, executive, and even judicial branches of government that make public policy decisions and actions, that somehow the decisions and actions that they're carrying out are really based on the will of all of these individuals down here. That's sort of a basic notion of democracy, right? That it's a bottom-up flow, not a top-down flow, in theory. Right? And notice in between these individuals and the institutions of government, you have what the systems theorists refer to as input structures, right? And that includes political parties, but it also includes interest groups, mass media, public opinion campaigns, and elections. Okay? They're positioned between individuals and government. Okay? Now, since we are focusing here on political parties, let me take the other ones out. Okay? So that we're just focused on political parties now. Okay? And remember Burnham's language. He says active intermediaries. Intermediary suggests somehow that positioning between here and here, right? Okay? But what he's really asking you to think about is the disappearance of political parties. All right? So let's just take political parties out as well. So that all we're left with are individuals in government. If we're talking about the American system here, 340 million individuals. Or if we just want to talk about the adult population, 280, 290 million individuals. And here's what they're asking you to consider. What can you do as an individual? This is you right here. That's you. What can you do as an individual that you would reasonably conclude would have a chance of having an impact on the policy decisions and actions that are made and carried out by government? Is there anything you can do? And if there is, tell me what it is. What can you do as an individual, acting as an individual, alone? And you have to be honest assessment here about the criteria that I've established, which is the criterion is, which is you have to be able to convince us that it can have an actual impact on what government does. See, most Americans would probably conclude that there's really not much that we can do. Oh, we can write a letter, right? We write a letter to elected officials, but most Americans never do that, right? I wonder why most Americans never do that. Is it because they believe, it's because they don't find, there are no political issues that they think are important, or that they are concerned about, or they have an interest in? No, it's probably because they judge that it's not going to have any effect, right? But if I was to ask you, can you give us a name, one that all of us will recognize, okay? Someone who could write that letter. If I go to Washington and I go to Senator Cornyn's office and I say, I need to see Senator Cornyn right now about a very important issue that's before the United States Senate, do you think I'm gonna, on a probability scale of 0 to 1, do you think I'm gonna get in to see Senator Cornyn? What's the probability? Maybe he just happens to be right there in the lobby at the time, but more than likely he's not, right? So what do you think the probability is that I get in to see Senator Cornyn? Or just some ordinary Texan? Or, you know, it can be any senator. I picked Cornyn because he's a senator from Texas, right?
Not going to happen.
It's not going to happen. It may not be an absolute 0 probability, but it is maybe, as our mathematician friends would say, asymptotically approaching 0. They're going to be nice to me, right? They're going to say, oh, sorry, Senator Cornyn can't see you. He's in a committee meeting. Is there a staff member that can help you? Or something like that, right? Can you think of somebody, though, give us a name of somebody who can walk into Senator Cornyn's office or who can write that letter and will get to see Senator Cornyn?
Matthew McConaughey.
Matthew McConaughey, interesting choice, okay? Because he's a Texan? Because he's I don't know, maybe?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, he is a Texan. Maybe. What is it about him, though, other than being a Texan, that gets him in and doesn't get me in?
International notoriety.
Okay, it's a celebrity. Okay. Yeah. Any other names somebody want to throw out there? You know, I usually, when I ask this kind of question, I usually get names like Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, Warren Buffett, and you see a pattern developing, right? It's usually people who have lots of money. Oh, as Soroff would say, most notably economic resources. Or as Burnham would say, the ascendancy of the already powerful, right? So unless you're one of the individuals down here who has loads of money, your chances of having an impact individually are pretty minuscule. If you have big money, your chances of having an individual impact are much greater. All right? You're left with an elite-dominated system. But that's exactly why political parties emerge in modern political systems, as Nate put it a few minutes ago, to give the little guy a chance. In other words, the way I would put it, it would be to say political parties emerge in modern political systems, as do other kinds of intermediary institutions, interest groups included. They emerge to allow those who can't have an individual impact to have an impact on government decision making collectively, through collective means rather than individual means. Now, the difference between political parties and interest groups is that political parties really are the only organizations in the political system that are capable of or even interested in fostering majority consensus. Interest groups, by their nature, aren't necessarily interested in majority rule democracy, to the extent that their interest runs counter to majority consensus. They're not interested in majority rule democracy at all. They're interested in getting their way, getting what they want. So that's why political parties are so important, right? Because political parties, by their nature, must foster majority consensus. That's what they do. They put together individuals based on a common philosophy, to use the conventions that the popular media uses when they make the distinction between Democrats and Republicans. You have the blues and the reds, right? So people who are deep blue Democrats, or maybe they're just kind of leaning Democrat, right? They're just, they lean towards Democrat, right? Or they're strong Republicans, or they just kind of lean Republican, or they're just kind of beige independents. I choose independents to be beige. Seems about right. Okay, so, they organize themselves into a coalition based on a common philosophy. It doesn't mean that all Democrats agree on everything. It doesn't mean that all Republicans agree on everything. There are going to be differences. There's going to be a lot that they do agree on, right? Right? But at a minimum, they have this common philosophy about the role of government in society, the kinds of things that government ought to be doing or ought not be doing, maybe kinds of economic agendas that they have, etc., right? Or cultural issues that, they may focus on, right? So when one of these coalitions, one of these groups of individuals can, form a coalition capable of a majority, then what can they do? How does all that translate? What's the mechanism for these people over here or these people over here to get what they want here? What is it that the parties do? Well, I'll tell you what, let's look at that. Let's just do it formally, okay? All right? So we can say that there are three basic purposes of a political party or of political parties, right? The first is that they organize individuals, as I just suggested in the diagram, right? With all the blues kind of getting together and all the reds kind of getting together over here, right? On the basis of some philosophy, okay, about the role of government. But notice that that's not an end. That's a means to an end. They don't organize individuals just for the sake of organization. What is the...
To elect a representative.
There you go. That's what I'm trying to get you to say, okay? So that they can capture government. Now, the mechanism for capturing government, taking over and controlling government, is winning elections. Now, for many Americans, I think the perception is that it ends right there. Do you agree that many Americans have that idea that all the Democrats really want to do is beat the Republicans? All the Republicans really want to do is beat the Democrats. That's it. It's all about winning. It is about winning, but winning is also just a means to an end, right? The end is to control the policy agenda. It's about policy. It's about taxes and health care and economic stimulus and all those issues that we would put under this broad heading of a policy agenda, right? That's the substantive orientation of this theory. This is a theory of the role of political parties in a democratic system. And as you might expect, as it often turns out, particularly in the study of politics, we have to point out that theory and reality don't always perfectly line up. But if we don't understand the theory, then it's going to be hard to make sense out of the reality of the situation. We've got to start with the theory, right? The theory is that this is what political parties are for. And I'm going to skip over some stuff here. If we have time on Thursday, we'll come back to it. But I want to move ahead and talk a little bit about, because I alluded to it a few minutes ago, two different types of political parties. Okay? The first, by the way, this distinction was initially made by the French political scientist Maurice Duverger. He says that there are two basic types of political parties, both historically and contemporaneously. What he calls a cadre party system, This is a party system that's dominated by political elites, and they're mainly concerned with contesting elections. They restrict the influence of outsiders. Outsiders are only tolerated to assist in election campaigns. This would seem to be characteristic of the first party system in the United States. When the Constitution was debated, you'll recall that there were two philosophical groups, two factions, philosophical factions, the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, right? And we hinted that those two mentalities, those two philosophies, which differed on, what was the main question that the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists were in dispute over?
The power of the national.
Which level of government should be more powerful, right? Which should be more, I guess that's not a completely accurate way to say it. The simplest way to say is that the Federalists believed that a stronger central government was imperative, right? It was essential, right? And the Anti-Federalists were very, very, very suspicious about giving the central government too much authority. Anyway, those two philosophical groups, after the Constitution went into effect, the first party system emerges very, very quickly. So that by the time George Washington's second term is coming to an end, you already have the makings of that first party system. The Federalist Party, which was founded and headed by Alexander Hamilton, and the opposition was the Republican Party, founded and headed by Thomas Jefferson. So that's not the same Republican Party as today. That's the Jeffersonian Republican Party. They didn't call themselves Jeffersonian Republicans, but that's to distinguish from the modern Republican Party. Okay? So that first party system, that was really a cadre party system. Remember, we're not to the Jacksonian period yet. We're not to the period where property qualifications are being dropped just yet. We're almost there, right? We're not to the period of the party system transforming into the second type, which is a mass membership party system. So, as it suggests, it unites hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of followers. Attempts to base itself on an appeal to the masses. And as I indicated there, and have been hinting, in the United States, the roots of this is the Jacksonian era. But through the 19th century and into the 20th century, with various democratizing features like the advent of the direct primary, which we will hopefully have a chance to talk about on Thursday. Okay, so these are the two basic types of party systems, and the party system that we have today with Democrats and Republicans is a mass membership party system. All right, questions about that distinction? Okay, let me skip this for just a second. I'll come back to it. Okay, here's another point, just very quickly, I want to get out of the way. Okay, we're going to talk here in a few minutes about why the United States has a dominant two-party system when most other democracies around the world have multi-party systems. But I do want to point out that even though we say that two-party system, we use that phraseology all the time. The United States has a two-party system, and it's accurate. It's not, I'm not suggesting to you it's not accurate, but I do want you to understand that they're really, if the two parties that we're talking about are the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, I do want you to understand that there's not just one Democratic Party, and there's not just one Republican Party. In fact, the structure of the party system mirrors very closely the structure of our system of government. We just very recently dealt with a topic on federalism. And you know, you have a sense of what federalism means, right? You have these levels of government, national, state, and local governments, all right? We have one national government, 50 state governments, and literally tens of thousands of local governments at the city, county level, special district governments. Well, you have a similar structure in the party system, both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. You have a national Democratic Party and a national Republican Party, but you also have 50 state Democratic parties, 50 state Republican parties, and then literally tens of thousands of Democratic parties and tens of thousands of Republican parties organized at the precinct, county, or congressional district level. And particularly the distinction between the national party and the state party is important because historically we've seen some real differences. In the middle part of the 20th century, for example, the National Democratic Party's platform, platform is the term that we use to refer to the party's statement of philosophy and policy proposals, policy ideals. You're going to be looking at, for core competency number 2, you're going to be looking at the platforms for both the National Democratic Party and the National Republican Party. Okay? So you're going to come away from that assignment not only with some sense of what personal and social responsibility are all about, but also where the emphasis is in the party's platform on those things, but more broadly on what's in the Democratic Party platform and what's in the Republican Party platform. But anyway, if we go back to the middle part of the 20th century, if we were to look at the party platform of the National Democratic Party on, say, the issue of civil rights and racial equality, we would find that it was far more progressive than many of the state Democratic parties, like, say, the Texas Democratic Party or the Mississippi Democratic Party or the Alabama Democratic Party, where those state parties, the Democratic Party, still supported segregation in the 1950s into the 1960s. Right? And today, we might see important differences, particularly in the Republican Party, the national party platform, and some of the state party platforms on maybe a number of issues. Those divisions seem to be more pronounced in the Republican Party today, more in the Democratic Party 50, 60 years ago. I'm talking about the divisions between the national party platform and the state party platform. So that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to understand. You know, in this course, your core competency 2 in the 2305 course, you're looking at the national party platforms. Can you, any guess what they might be looking at in the Texas government course, the 2306 course? The state party platforms. And they are different. Yeah, they are different. Okay, so there's that aspect of the party system. Yeah, it's accurate to say a two-party system, but please just bear in mind that there's not just one Democratic Party and one Republican Party. Okay, we'll come back to that if we have time. Let's move on. We only have about 10 minutes or so remaining, so let me at least ground on this next item, which is, and we'll develop this further on Thursday. Why is the American system characterized as a dominant two-party system? As I said, it's not exclusively in the United States, but the United States, the party system in the United States is not typical of party systems in other democracies. It's not the preeminent model of party systems, this two-party system. In fact, most other democracies have multi-party systems. Okay, so why in the United States is it different? As I said, it's not exclusive to the United States, but it's very pronounced in the United States. Okay? There are maybe a couple of other countries that we might point to that have at least modified two-party systems. The UK would be one. The UK, for example, in the United States, we have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In the UK, they have the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But if some of you are familiar with Britain, you may know that at least from time to time, they have a reasonably important third party called the Liberal Party. Okay? And I say Canada is similar, right? It's basically a two-party system with some, room for a third party to have some significant role to play. And there are maybe a couple of other countries that we could point to, but as I say, most are multi-party systems. So what are some of the explanations that have been offered by political scientists and historians, other analysts as to this dominant two-party system? So the first thing that I have on my list here is history or tradition. And I want to be fair in my representation of this argument, but I'm going to confess to you before I tell you what it is, that I think it's extremely weak. It's hard for me to be, in part because I try to be a little clever with the way I say things. I find this argument to be extremely weak. So it basically goes like this. The reason that we have a dominant two-party system in the United States is that we have historically had a dominant two-party system in the United States. And I find that a very unsatisfying. In fact, it's really not an explanation at all, because it doesn't, at a minimum, it doesn't tell us why we had a two-party system from the beginning. And frankly, the risk of drawing the ire of some of my colleagues in the history area, I'm going to tell you that history doesn't explain anything. Please don't run off and tell Professor Grubb or someone that told you that history was not worthwhile. I think the study of history is very worthwhile. In fact, I was a history major as an undergraduate. But what I'm saying is that a historical pattern does not explain a historical pattern. Consider this. If someone was to ask me, my background is in economics, so let me use sort of an example from economics. If somebody was to ask me, hey, Professor Fagan, why is it that gasoline prices tend to go up in the summer months? You look, you have some data at your disposal, and you see that there's a pretty consistent pattern of gasoline prices going up during the summer. Why do gasoline prices go up in the summer? And I say to you, well, because they always go up in the summer. You would not be satisfied, would you? It's fairly ridiculous to offer as an explanation, right? It is true that we have had historically a dominant two-party system in the United States. I mentioned to you that the first party system featured competition between the Federalists and the Jeffersonian Republicans, right? Now, the Federalist Party died out around the second decade of the 19th century. So by the time we get to the 18 teens, the Federalist Party is waning and dying out. And you have this very brief period of one-party dominance where the Republicans are the dominant party. The historians refer to this as the era of good feelings. You remember learning about this in your American history course? Okay? But the Jeffersonian Republicans, by the way, are now calling themselves the Democratic Republicans. Actually, that term Democratic Republicans was pinned on them by their Federalist opponents. Initially, it was kind of an insult. Called the Republicans the Democratic Republicans. You know how today, have you ever noticed that today when you hear like Republican politicians, I'm talking about today in 2021, right? When you hear Republican politicians or Republican pundits and so on talk about their Democratic opponents, they say Democrat, they don't say the Democrat Party. It's like they so detest their opponents that they can't even bring themselves to dignify their opponents by giving them that adjective form of the word. The Democrat Party. It's not the Democrat Party. That's not the adjective form. It's Democratic. The Democratic Party. That would be like, instead of saying the Republican Party, the Republic Party. But I don't think it's a coincidence that they do that. I think they do it as a term of derision. Kind of like what the Federalists were doing in referring to the Republicans back then as the Democratic Republicans. It was an insult. But somewhere along the way, the Republicans decided that they liked it. And they started calling themselves the Democratic Republicans. And it wasn't too much longer after that that they dropped the Republican part altogether and just started referring to themselves as the Democratic Party. So during this era of good feelings, or at least shortly after the era of good feelings, the Democratic Republicans sort of fracture, and you have the growth of this, or you have the emergence of this faction called the National Republican Party. So you have National Republicans versus Democratic Republicans. By the time we get to the 1830s, Andrew Jackson's period, right, the Democratic Republicans drop the Republican part and they're just calling themselves the Democratic Party. And then the National Republicans die out. You have a new party that emerges called the Whig Party, based on the English Whig Party. And then the Whig Party dies out. By the time you get to the 1850s, a coalition of former Whigs, anti-slavery Democrats, Freemasons, some others form the modern Republican Party. Right? So since the 1850s, you've had this two-party competition between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. Did you know? Here's something for those of you who think about yourselves as Democrats to hang your hats on, right? The Democratic Party has a long history and a proud tradition. It's not just party of Joe Biden and Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. It's the party of John F. Kennedy and Franklin Roosevelt and Andrew Jackson, and can even trace its roots back to Thomas Jefferson. The Democratic Party has a long history, and as I say, a good argument can be made that it traces its origins back to Thomas Jefferson. So Democrats have nothing to be embarrassed about or ashamed about in that regard. It's the oldest political party in continuous existence as a mass membership party anywhere in the world. Political parties existed in Britain, of course, before that, but they were confined to the Parliament. The Tories and the Whigs were parliamentary parties. They didn't reach out to commoners, right? Remember, we're talking about mass membership parties here, right? The Democratic Party is the oldest party in the world in that regard. And those of you who think of yourselves as Republicans also have a very proud history and tradition. It's not just the political party of Donald Trump. Some would question whether it actually is the same party under Donald Trump. But it's not just the party of George W. Bush and George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan. It traces its roots back at least to Abraham Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt in the early 20th century, Abraham Lincoln in the 1850s, John Fremont. It is the second oldest political party in continuous existence anywhere in the world. The Republicans also have a very proud history and tradition. But again, I don't want to digress too much on that point. What I'm trying to get you to understand here is that we have had all along this timeline, the history is that we've had competition between two major political parties. So that argument is accurate. We have historically had a dominant two-party system. By the way, when we say a dominant two-party system, doesn't that imply that there are other political parties that have existed along the timeline? And this is certainly not a comprehensive or exhaustive list. I've just selected a few and thrown them out there. A very small number of them, in fact. Most of them, you'll notice that most of them come into existence and then they sort of go away very quickly. It's an interesting phenomenon with third parties or minor parties. But again, resisting the temptation to pursue that, let me just ask you, why do we consider them minor parties? Why do we put them over here and not over here? What is the criteria for doing that? Why do we say we have a dominant two-party system? What did we say? What did you tell us, Joanna, that political parties have to do? They have to win elections. What we're really saying here is the reason that we have a dominant two-party system in the United States is because historically there have only been two political parties that really have a reasonable chance of getting candidates to elected to office. It's not that you don't have third parties or minor parties, but we call them minor parties for a reason. The Libertarian Party just isn't going to get their candidates elected more than just one very, very occasionally and for some extraordinary reason. Right? If you look at the United States Congress today and historically, it's had nothing but Democrats and Republicans in it. Presidents have been either Democrats or Republicans. Governors have been either Democrats or Republicans. State legislatures have been either Democrats or Republicans. No Greens Party, no New Alliance Party, no Reform Party candidates. Again, except for a very occasional one under very extraordinary circumstances. Okay, so we're out of time. That gets us the first explanation. And again, I'm going to tell you that's a very weak explanation. Despite the fact that it's true that we've historically had a dominant two-party system, it really doesn't explain why we have a two-party system. Okay, so we'll finish this up on Thursday.
You like the McConaughey reference, didn't you?
Yeah, it surprised me.
Well, I figured, yeah, you know, Bill Gates, Bezos, Musk, yeah,